Loveless is an album as complicated as it was groundbreaking. It served to inspire generations of British rock, opening up new avenues of creativity never tried before. But it was a miracle the album was ever completed in the first place. One record executive was driven to nervous breakdown while his company was bankrupted, and it ended with the band desperate for funding after almost 2 years of recording, and the creative mastermind was almost lost forever, with almost a decade and a half passing for the band to make a follow-up album. Welcome back to Behind the Music. In this video, we dive into the torturous story behind the production of My Bloody Valentine's Loveless and the near miracle it required to complete the album.
Yeah, some kid, a 12-year-old, asked me to play guitar in his group. And I sort of got a guitar a few months later and we started rehearsing every Sunday kind of thing. It's about 1980.
In the early 80s, Kevin Shields and Colin McKissick were immersed in the Irish punk scene, playing the Sex Pistols and Ramones covers to make a living. Shields, who was the creative mastermind, had immigrated back to Ireland from the United States at the age of 10, where he found a much more lively and young music scene. It was then that he began playing guitar and collaborating with Kiosuk. Together, they formed My Bloody Valentine with a roster of rotating artists and were determined to make their own unique sound. But they were truly a self-start band, forced to put up the money for recording sessions on independent record labels, betting on themselves. By 1987, though, the band, which had settled on a lineup of Shields, Kiosuk, along with Debbie Googe on bass and Belinda Butcher on vocals, and started to attract a following in London. Their first breakthrough was the single Sunny Sunday Smile, which made it to number 6 on the UK Indie Singles chart. Despite this modest success, though, My Bloody Valentine was still funding their own studio time, and when Creation Records stepped in to offer full funding, which allowed them to produce the EP, You Made Me Realize, which found more success than they had ever experienced. Creation Records knew they were betting on the right horse. At the time, My Bloody Valentine were a big emerging band, and their first album had found a small but loyal audience. What Creation didn't know was that their next album was posed to cost £250,000 and essentially bankrupted the label. But in the annals of the music world, it would be one of the most important of the 1990s. Loveless, which started without a name, was an extensive operation. It began with a simple vision of what guitarist and founder Kevin Shields could be completed in less than a week. Arriving at Blackwing Studios in February 1989, though, it soon became obvious that this was out of the question. At Blackwing, the group ultimately spent months rather than days, and they eventually shifted studios, something that would become a matter of routine. Their next obstacle was their engineer, who they didn't believe was meaningfully contributing anything. It would take another move before finding an engineer they respected, Alan Moulder, who would go on to work with the Smashing Pumpkins, Nine Inch Nails, The Cure, and U2. In fact, My Bloody Valentine didn't trust any supporting engineers with the job, instead relying almost exclusively on Moulder to mic up amps, record, mix, and do everything in between. As the first year dragged into 1990, they had once again changed engineers to a woman named Anjali Dutt. But no studio was deemed up to the band's standards. Before the completion of the album, they would use almost 20 different studios. For many of the songs, only one piece of the track would be recorded at a time. Some wouldn't have vocals for more than a year, meaning that the songs didn't even have titles, just numbers. The gaps in between recording could be so long that Shields would forget the specific tuning used. In fact, the vocals were the last component to be added, which were done in mid-1991, more than 2 years after recording began. Far from easy, though. This section of recording was more complicated than ever, made even more difficult by the band's insistence on secrecy. During vocal recordings, engineers weren't allowed to listen directly to the vocals. Anjali Dutt later recalled that on most sessions, Kevin Shields and Belinda Butcher, who did vocals, would arrive without any lyrics ready. But this was a process that ultimately worked, even if it took years to perfect. As for the content of the album, nearly all of it was written by Kevin Shields himself, who seemed to have little trust in his bandmates. Belinda Butcher, who usually played guitar as well as vocals, had her parts performed by Shields, and bassist Debbie Googe has said that she would barely visit the studio since she was rarely needed. Loveless was largely the product of Shields' single-minded creative vision. Some of his techniques have become synonymous with the album's sound, like the use of the tremolo bar on the guitar during strumming, which momentarily brings it slightly out of tune. On top of that, Shields has explained that there are actually very few effects used. Instead, different sounds are achieved by playing through equalizer preamps or even adjusting EQ levels manually during recording. The extensive use of feedback and distortion helped Shields create the sound of different instruments. As for the drums, sample packs were recorded by Colin Mokosuk in advance because he was sick during much of the production time, and the vocals were layered to give a less clear output, making them more sensual. On some tracks, like When You Sleep, Shields said that finding the perfect recording grew so tiresome and laborious that he decided to use all 12 different versions mixed together. The result of the intense, lengthy, and complicated production were songs like Only Shallow, where the dreamy vocals of Belinda Butcher are spliced with a chaotic, distorted sampling of guitar riffs driven by a simple rock beat. This style is characteristic of the album. In the song Soon, the music video matches the effervescent yet foggy. I Only Said opens with a near-cinematic melody, which blends into verses where Shields' bending guitar is on full display, which has been described as like screaming ghosts. The album is to many a masterpiece in experimental rock. While the band's punk rock roots are identifiable, they are obscured by bold new techniques, directions, and combinations, forming a pioneering magnum opus of the so-called shoegaze genre. But this masterpiece didn't come cheap. Constant interruptions and the quest for perfection not only slowed down production, but brought Creation Records to its knees. The label was footing the bill for the endless studio changes, new equipment, and staff replacements. By July 1991, Creation couldn't afford for My Bloody Valentine to relocate again, or even to pay the previous bill, meaning that the studio would keep the band's equipment as collateral. Kevin Shields was forced to raise the money himself, just as the band did earlier in their career. The difference was, Shields was now syncing an entire record label with them. The delays, interruptions, and financial difficulties tipped some at Creation Records over the edge. Dick Green, an executive at the company, once called Shields in tears, demanding that he complete the record for the sake of his own mental health. Green's co-workers reported him constantly feeling stressed, anxious, and even his hair turning gray. At the worst possible time, the recording was delayed again after Shields and Butcher were affected by tinnitus. By the time the album's recording came to a close in November 1991, 19 different studios had been used, and an estimated £250,000 spent, which would be about $865,000 today. Shields himself estimated that the true number was closer to £160,000 or $554,000. As an independent label, this was a huge bill for Creation Records, which not long after was sold to Sony, going on to produce two of Oasis's biggest records. On its release, critics were enamored with the bold and innovative sound of Loveless. Fans had waited years for My Bloody Valentine to release a third album, and to everyone, it was worth it. To some, it was a challenging and confronting listen, but no doubt artistic. It received top ratings from virtually every major music publication, including Rolling Stone magazine, Pitchfork, NME, and Melody Maker. At the time of its release, though, it didn't break into popular music in the same way that Nirvana or Pearl Jam did. It did go on to inspire generations of British music, though, from The Clash, The Velvet Underground, The Cure, The Smashing Pumpkins to Radiohead. And this turned into modest success in the commercial world, too. Loveless made it to the top 30 UK albums charts, selling over 200,000 copies by year 2000. It is consistently ranked as one of the best albums of all the 1990s, if not all time. But the process of the album seemed to have torn apart the band and ripped Kevin Shields' creative soul from him. Shields retreated to his home studio, but for years was unable to produce any more music. He later said that the music didn't have the spirit or life in it that My Bloody Valentine's earlier music did. Despite having recorded up to 60 hours of material, the band went separate ways in 1997. Instead, Shields began collaborating with other artists and contributing as an engineer. He would later appear in a number of live performances and became a fixture on Primal Scream tours. Shields composed original music for Sofia Coppola's 2003 film, Lost in Translation. And 4 years later, My Bloody Valentine reunited for a worldwide tour before releasing their long-awaited third studio album entitled MBV in 2013, once again to widespread critical acclaim. Fans were happy to hear Shields confirm that the band is now working on new material, but it will be hard to top the artistry or legendary story of Loveless, which makes it one of the most memorable albums of all time. That's it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth videos that go behind the music. We'll talk to you again in the next one.